I know this has happened to you. There's something in the news, an odd fact that grabs your attention. Maybe a friend mentioned something. It's strange, upsetting, and it might even make you mad or frightened. It's one of those things that just can't be a random act of the universe. It has to be the result of organized, malevolent forces working to destabilize, conquer, and destroy. Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't have acted alone in the JFK assassination. 9/11 had to be an inside job. Those aren't trails of condensed water vapor behind airplanes in the sky, they're chemtrails. The Earth is flat. The moon landing never happened. There were UFOs and aliens stored at Area 51. All of these beliefs stem from wanting to make sense of what appears to be senseless things. We feel powerless when something bad happens, so finding a reason might help us regain control and a feeling of safety. Or maybe, by connecting all the dots, we reveal a truth that no one else sees, making us feel unique and superior. And if we find others who believe the same thing, we're no longer alone with our fears. Conspiracy theories have always been out there as we attempt to understand why. We want to restore order. We want to reclaim clarity. And the more complex the world becomes, and the more people that can connect online, the more conspiracies appear. Wake up, sheeple. Can't you see what's really going on? I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 68 of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And we're about to embark on a journey through music's greatest conspiracies. And let me tell you something. Have I got some wild stories to tell you? Conspiracy theories have been with us for thousands of years. It's possible that the first widespread such theory emerged in 64 AD with the Great Fire of Rome under Emperor Nero. It was said he needed space for a giant palace, a monument to himself. But there was no room in Rome, so he started a fire to clear space. That was the rumor spread throughout the empire. To combat that, Nero launched a counter-conspiracy theory. He blamed early Christians, and when Nero died 4 years later, the conspiracists contended that he'd actually faked his own death and was soon going to launch a military takeover of the empire from the east. The first time the term conspiracy theory appeared in print was 1863, when the author Charles Astor Bristed had a letter published in the New York Times that contended British aristocrats were actually actively working to sabotage the Union during the American Civil War. The goal, he said, was to advance their own financial interests. Exactly 100 years later, conspiracy theory was the term thrown about by the CIA as a way to discredit their official narrative of the JFK assassination. The music world has its own conspiracies, and we can probably start with Mozart. When he died at the age of 35 on December 5th, 1791, it was probably due to a strep infection, which led to heart and kidney failure. In the 2 weeks before his death, he had a high fever, rashes, body aches, and severe swelling of his hands and feet. Of course, there were no modern autopsies back then, but given these symptoms and his spiral to death have led medical experts to believe he suffered from post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, kidney inflammation, and bronchial pneumonia. He already had suffered from related bouts of rheumatic fever, something that had plagued him all his life. The medical treatment of the day didn't help either. He was prescribed bloodletting to ease the fever and swelling, something that just weakened him further. But what about the popular rumor that his jealous rival, the composer Antonio Salieri, poisoned him? He fed Mozart mercury and arsenic. And didn't he confess after suffering a nervous breakdown brought on by the guilt of what he did? It's all there in the movie Amadeus, right? Well, no. Much of this comes from gossip that rippled through Vienna after Mozart died. Salieri did sputter something about being responsible for Mozart's death, but he was in the middle of a nervous breakdown. He had attempted suicide in November 1823, and for the last 18 months of his life, he suffered from severe dementia. This is decades after Mozart died. Around the same time, the chattering classes of the German and Italian music circles whispered the same thing. So yes, Salieri and Mozart were very public rivals and may have said or written mean things about each other, but Salieri was actually quite well off financially. There's even evidence that he supported Mozart. In fact, Salieri took on the task of educating Mozart's son, who was born 4 months after his father died. Okay, so let's just ask the question. Was Mozart poisoned by Salieri? The whole idea has been declared ridiculous by scholars. That conspiracy theory has been debunked. Mozart was felled by a strep infection in the years before antibiotics. Let's skip ahead to the two conspiracies connected to Robert Johnson, the great and mysterious blues musician. The first has to do with what seemed to some as a sudden supernatural ability to play the guitar. In the 1920s, he struggled with the instrument and was often ridiculed when he asked to play with more accomplished musicians. And then, sometime in 1929, after a spell living in Robinsonville, Mississippi, he dropped out of sight. And when he appeared sometime later, accounts differ, but 2 years seems to be the sweet spot, he'd become a master of the blues guitar with a style that no one had ever heard or seen before. The legend is that one summer's night at midnight, Johnson encountered the devil at a crossroad somewhere in the vicinity of the Dockery Plantation in the northwestern part of the state. The beast took Johnson's guitar, tuned it, and then played a few songs to test it out. The devil then returned it to Johnson, saying that he was now a master guitarist, and for payment, all Johnson had to do was hand over his soul for all eternity upon his death. Great story, but the same thing was said of Delta blues musician Tommy Johnson, no relation to Robert. Over the decades, the tales were embellished, especially after a larger audience discovered Johnson's music through some compilation records in the late 1950s. Retellings only reinforced the myth, and the concept of someone selling their soul to Satan in exchange for earthly powers and riches has been around for centuries, so Robert Johnson's tale was probably just a copycat tale. The truth, though, seems to be rather mundane. Johnson simply sought out more accomplished players and asked for lessons. One such teacher was a bluesman named Ike Zimmerman. It appears that he met with Johnson in a series of graveyards at night, not because of anything supernatural, but because it was quiet and no one would disturb them. Johnson was a good student, and after 2 years of lessons and diligent practice, he turned out to have real talent. No Satan required. Johnson's death on August 16, 1938, is also the subject of conspiracy talk. There was no autopsy, and the death certificate didn't contain any helpful information. And into this vacuum poured speculation and rumor. One had Johnson murdered by a jealous husband. Johnson had been flirting with his wife at a dance at the Three Forks Club in the town of Itabena. When he asked for a drink, the woman gave him a bottle of whiskey. Unbeknownst to either of them, the whiskey had been laced with strychnine, rat poison. A few hours later, Johnson fell ill and was helped back to his room. Over the next 3 days, he got sicker and sicker and sicker. He was in tremendous pain and suffered convulsions and seizures. He vomited blood constantly. And then he died. But was it strychnine? It has a strong smell and a very bad taste. Even straight whiskey wouldn't be enough to cover that up. If the whiskey was dosed with strychnine, a fatal amount would have killed him within hours, not days. Another possible poison could have been dissolved mothballs, which contain the chemical naphthalene. In the Deep South, a lot of nuisance people were removed that way. There are also stories about the man who poisoned the whiskey, allegedly, was tracked down and eventually confessed. Maybe, but we never did get a name. The truth seems to be a little less conspiratorial. Johnson was a dog and likely had congenital syphilis. A doctor had also diagnosed Johnson with severe stomach ulcers. He also had something called esophageal varices, which can be brought on by excessive drinking, cirrhosis, and acid reflux. Something happened during Johnson's last days which caused those veins in his esophagus to hemorrhage, which explains the abdominal pain, the vomiting, and all the bleeding from the mouth. Could poisoned whiskey have been the trigger to all that? Well, again, maybe, but no one has been able to prove that he was poisoned. What we have is a couple of great stories and the foundations of modern music's fascination with the occult. If you want to go deeper into the life, times, and death of Robert Johnson, check out episode 30 of Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And because he died at the age of 27, Robert Johnson is also part of the 27 Club theory. I discuss that conspiracy in detail in episode 28. The best conspiracies are those that have an element of truth to them. And here's an example. During the Cold War, the U.S. government sponsored a series of cultural exchange programs with the Soviet Union. American performers would be sent to the USSR, and the Soviets would do the same in return. It was cultural diplomacy during these very tense political times. Such was the atmosphere at the time that it's 100% certain that each side had spies embedded in their respective tours. The conspiracy lies with who those spies were. It is suggested that the musicians themselves were enlisted to do a little espionage on the side. This included names such as Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, Nina Simone, and Louis Armstrong. They were known as jazz ambassadors and were sent out internationally to show America's greatness when it came to music and culture. Far-fetched, right? Well, no. Jazz really was weaponized by the United States. These tours were used for spying, the gathering of intelligence, and opportunities to destabilize regimes that the U.S. didn't like. For example, in November 1960, Louis Armstrong was on one of these diplomatic tours through Africa. One night in Leopoldville, the capital of the newly independent Congo, Larry Devlin, his host at dinner that night, turned out not to be a political attaché, but the head of the CIA in the country. Devlin was in the Congo to sort out what was happening in the breakaway province of Katanga, an area where American companies had mining interests for vast stores of uranium ore. It was arranged for Armstrong to tour through Katanga, accompanied by Devlin. Armstrong was used as cover for Devlin and his agents to spy on what was actually going on. Meanwhile, Devlin and the CIA were also on a mission to assassinate Patrice Lumumba, the Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, because he seemed a little too friendly to the Soviets. Again, with Armstrong as cover, Devlin was free to do his snooping. 2 months later, after Armstrong was back in the States, Lumumba was murdered in Katanga province and replaced with a military chief named Joseph Désiré Mobutu, who was firmly on the side of the CIA and U.S. corporate interests. At the time, the CIA and the American government denied any involvement in the coup, but the story started coming out in 1975, 15 years later, and more recently, documents about an agent named Y. Rogue, who was very involved in Lumumba's killing. We've since learned that the CIA was probably involved in a coup in Ghana and maybe even the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. For his part, Armstrong maintained that he knew nothing of how he'd been used. He eventually helped write a musical entitled The Real Ambassadors, which referenced what had happened to him in the early 1960s. He said, "Though I represent the government don't represent some of the policies I'm for." If you want more information on how jazz was unwittingly used to pursue nefarious interests by the U.S. government, there are several books on this subject, along with a documentary entitled Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. In a moment, well, let's just say that this is not the first time the CIA, or its counterpart the KGB, have been implicated in some kind of music conspiracy. For example, did you know that punk rock was invented by the KGB? Again, wake up, sheeple. That story is next. One of the most powerful weapons in conflicts between nations is soft power. No guns, no bombs, no aerial attacks, no troops on the ground. Soft power is the ability of one nation to influence another without the need for bullets or any obvious violent coercion. It's kind of like propaganda, but is so deeply encoded it doesn't really look like it. A government of one country may seek to destabilize the situation in another through the use of culture. If the population of the target country is sufficiently enticed by the cultural offerings of the enemy, then perhaps the people will slowly be persuaded to start questioning the quality of life at home and begin demanding more from their home government. Thus, internal change, and even regime change, is encouraged, and the enemy falls, or at least changes their way, through a popular uprising. A variation on that is to encourage a counterculture in the target country, one that will generate hostility toward the ruling elite, resulting in big trouble for them. It is a fact that the KGB did whatever they could to weaponize the Western counterculture of the 1960s. Psychological warfare operations were launched to take advantage of youth anger over the Vietnam War. They wanted to throw gasoline on racial tensions and otherwise find ways to destabilize Western democracies from within. There were disinformation campaigns. Agents in the field were charged with stirring things up at rallies and protests. And there was the whole useful idiots strategy, where the KGB covertly funded radical anti-government organizations. Of course, the US and other Western nations did the same in the opposite direction. They were also highly opportunistic. And music was one way the West hoped to corrupt the youth of the Eastern Bloc. While music from acts like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were outlawed, there were efforts by Western governments to smuggle that music in. It is true that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev hated rock and roll. Here's a quote from 1962. "Take these new dances, which are so fashionable now. Some of them are completely improper. You wiggle a certain part of your anatomy, if you'll pardon the expression. It's indecent." He believed that music and art would ennoble the individual and arouse him to action. That's what soft power can do. One way the West did this was through radio, beamed into the Eastern Bloc via shortwave, medium wave, and long wave broadcasts. The other way was to somehow get records across tight borders to the kids dying to hear them. There were some really bizarre attempts to counteract this. In 1959, the East German government was alarmed by rock and roll and the endless stream of dance crazes coming from the West. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis were seen as vulgar, uncivilized, and not within the values of the revolution. The Stasi, the East German secret police, attempted to staunch this flow of Western soft power by inventing its own dance. It was called the Lipsy. The Lipsy was created by party committees as a bulwark against American rock and roll and its shameless sexualized dancing. "Dance if you must," the message was, "but our youth will do so while remaining pure and innocent." The Lipsy had some very rigid rules. No movement of the hips was allowed because that was too sexual, and dancers were required to keep a minimum distance from each other. East German teenagers laughed at this attempt, and the whole thing was a flop. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Soviet hippies, yes, they existed and were known as stilaji, which can be translated as style hunters, were under constant surveillance. Every once in a while, there would be a violent crackdown, and hippies and stilaji would be thrown in jail, sent to a gulag, or worse. In 1968, the state commissioned the creation of an official rock band. They were a clean-cut bunch called, believe it or not, the Happy Guys, and they sang songs that said, "The world is fine, and the USSR is especially great." That didn't work. Then the authorities had an epiphany. If they couldn't stop rock, they could at least try to limit its bite, to control its musicians and fans alike, while under KGB supervision. So, starting in 1969, the KGB got into the club business. That was a failure. Again, here we have examples of how a modicum of truth will lead to wilder claims of conspiracy. These theories come in when people begin to suggest that foreign forces invented aspects of Western counterculture. In the 1970s, Britain was in a rough state. Its economy was in shambles, everyone was going on strike, and there was tremendous income inequality. And on top of that, there was the British class system. Your lot in life was determined largely from the moment you were born. And this obviously did not sit well with millions of underemployed young people who felt that they had no prospects of anything whatsoever. Out of this demographic, economic, and social stew came punk rock, a reaction against all the powers that be from the monarchy on down. The causes of punk were many and complex, but some people believe that it was all the work of the KGB. Here is a story told by an alleged retired KGB agent named Alexandrov Verenikov Volishin. He claimed that the entire punk rock movement of the 1970s, from the Ramones to the Sex Pistols to the Clash, was invented and financed by forces within the Kremlin. The goal, he said, was to create utter chaos and to pervert Western youth to nihilist, anti-establishment, and anti-American ideologies. He also claimed that many punk songs were written by teams of propagandists and psychologists who were experts in psyops, psychological warfare, and their goal was to increase cynicism, promote revolutionary thinking, in the communist sense of the revolution, and to encourage heavy drug use among Western youth. Here is a quote. "Our mission was to use teenage angst to our advantage and turn the baby boomer generation of the West into a decadent, pro-drug and anti-establishment culture that would create uprisings and bring Western democracies into utter chaos. We even infiltrated mainstream radios to promote their music and reach millions of people every day. For many of us in the KGB, infiltrating the 1970s punk scene was one of the USSR's most successful experiments of propaganda to date. All right, so now you might start connecting some dots. Remember the shocking iconography of British punks in the 1970s? That included things like swastikas and hammers and sickles. There was opposition to the monarchy, the hatred of the class system, and all the violence that went along with it. Could it be that all this was encouraged and financed by the KGB? Well, hold on. There is no such person as Alexandrov Varenikov Volition. This entire story came from a site called World News Daily Report, which is very much like The Onion. It's fake, it's satire. But every few years, this story circulates again online before it has to be debunked again. Still, a lot of people believe that there are elements to this plot that are true. Here's another story. Crass was a band, but also an anarchistic collective based out of the UK, and they loved to poke at the establishment with a pointed stick. Their story goes like this. It is said that in the early 1980s, they met a former skinhead who had become a sailor, who had just returned to England after a tour of duty in the Falkland Islands. He told stories of how crazy things had been, and some of what he said was genuine classified information, material that was being kept secret from the public. The members of Crass were fascinated and wrote everything down this guy said. Then they had an idea. Let's cut together some speeches of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher to make it sound like we had a leaked tape of a phone call between them. They then released this tape to an unsuspecting world. Let's have a listen. Newspapers all over Europe got a copy of that tape. It was news for a while, but then Crass was exposed and the joke was over. Or was it? The tape continued to be discussed by the CIA and MI5. What were Crass's real motivations? Could they have had contact with Russian agents? Were they being financed by the Russians? Some in the spy community believed so, and if it wasn't the Soviets, it had to be operatives from Argentina, the country the UK fought over the Falklands. A dossier was opened on the band and was kept secret for 30 years. The members of Crass had their phones tapped. Intelligence specialists from the CIA also looked at the tape and opened an investigation. But then, shortly after the hoax was uncovered, Crass was invited to a meeting at what was supposedly a Russian literary magazine in London. Why? And by who? It didn't stop. Crass was courted by all sorts of shady organizations, including the real KGB. Reps from Germany's vicious Baader-Meinhof group turned up in their back garden. Let's have a talk, they said. What else could they offer? Did they need any assistance? Do you know anything else that could be of interest to us? Even the Irish Republican Army sent word that Crass should not worry because they were watching their backs. Crass admits that they were terrified. Their prank had turned into something genuinely dangerous to them, and also their country and the West. Remember, It's not nice to fool with a country's national security apparatus. I have one more story involving the CIA. Do you like gangsta rap? Well, then you're going to love this. There is, and always has been, immense distrust of all forms of law enforcement in the inner cities of America, and the black community has often been a target. There was every reason to be suspicious and angry. The FBI established a program called COINTELPRO in 1956. Its mission was to infiltrate, surveil, and then discredit and destroy black political organizations. The targets were the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. COINTELPRO was a real thing. Its existence was made public through government hearings in 1975, and while it was officially discontinued, the FBI continued their efforts in other ways. Meanwhile, there were suspicions that secret government forces were looking to keep black communities from getting too powerful. You may have heard theories that some shadowy government forces deliberately introduced crack cocaine into these communities. This also involved the CIA, which allowed Contra rebels in Nicaragua free rein in South Los Angeles in exchange for support back home. As an aside, Gary Webb, a journalist who broke the story, died in 2004 from 2 gunshots to the back of the head. And this was ruled a suicide. Interesting. The drug problem, along with the AIDS epidemic, which some say was also perpetrated by the government, resulted in widespread poverty, violence, and gang warfare. And those were the conditions that led to the rise of gangsta rap, music that told of the realities of living in places like South Central Los Angeles. And here's where the conspiracy begins. Sometime in 1999, an anonymous letter started circulating on the internet, which was still very new to a lot of people. This letter was supposedly written by a music industry insider who claimed to have been at a secret meeting of 24 music bosses in 1991. No names are given. Everyone at the meeting was told this: you will be given exclusive contracts to create and distribute a new form of music that was harder, more extreme, more violent, and more nihilistic than any hip-hop or rap that currently existed. We, whoever we was, will make sure that this music gets everywhere: radio stations, video channels, record stores, music magazines. And this, they said, will generate an insane amount of money for you. For us, whoever us was, it will keep black communities destabilized, and that will provide a steady source of inmates for the increasingly privatized American prison system. So, everybody wins, right? Now, to be clear, this letter was anonymous, and it was never attributed to anyone. No one who was allegedly at this meeting has ever spoken about it, and the source of this letter has never been discovered. But the internet being the internet, this was evidence of a government and music industry conspiracy. It spread everywhere, and it still circulates today. Some theories allege, to make sure that everybody got along, private prison companies purchased shares in major record labels. There's the incentive for the record labels beyond the sales of music. The more young black men jailed, the more profitable all these investments became. In other words, the record industry and the private prison industry worked together to manufacture crime, fund the culture, arrest and imprison people who participated in this culture, and then make money off their incarceration as well as their record sales. And yes, the private prison industry did take off in America in the 1990s, and those prisons continued to be disproportionately populated by young black men. Some tendrils extend to Suge Knight, the notorious head of Death Row Records and home to Tupac Shakur. Some contend that financing for Death Row came from sources connected to the U.S. intelligence community. Why? Because Death Row specialized in some of the most violent, anti-police, and nihilistic rap in existence. So it was perfect for the aims of whoever was behind this scheme. As proof, conspiracy theorists point out that gangster rap went on to become one of the defining sounds of the 90s, pushing socially conscious hip-hop to the margins. Again, there was no documentation to any of this, nor has anyone anywhere ratted out this plot. However, people like Chuck D of Public Enemy, rapper KRS-One, and others have said that hip-hop and rap were manipulated by the music industry, especially when it came to making sure socially conscious and political music took a back seat to this violent stuff. I mean, how else could you explain the sudden rise of gangsta rap and the rapid decline of socially conscious material? But let's unpack this. Gangsta rap definitely reflected the reality of living in certain parts of America. The records released by groups like NWA, Ice-T, and the Ghetto Boys struck a nerve with audiences who bought them of their own free will. Besides, the CIA and the FBI aren't that powerful when it comes to this kind of social engineering across a large population over many years, and this theory assumes that black artists were puppets and were manipulated into doing something by some shadowy government department instead of being creators documenting their life experiences. It all comes down to this. Considering what governments have done and continue to do, is something like the gangsta rap conspiracy really that crazy? The existence of COINTELPRO is a fact, the connection between the CIA and cocaine smuggling is real, and there are a lot of private prisons with black men. You can see why this has legs. And we're not done here. There are plenty more conspiracies that we need to talk about, and we will continue these investigations on our next episode of Uncharted, Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. You're going to love this stuff. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. They're all free for the taking. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, email me at alan@alancross.ca. We can meet up on all the social media sites, along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com, which is updated with music news and recommendations every day. It also comes with a free daily newsletter filled with music news, opinion, and music recommendations. And there's my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music and alternative music throughout the decades. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy all for free. See you next time for more conspiracy stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.